Fort Bragg, North Carolina, March 1966, Captain James Mitchell of the U.S. Army Special Forces stood in a briefing room with 23 other Green Berets waiting to meet foreign instructors, invited for a joint exercise. The men around him were confident, seasoned, and among the most elite soldiers America had produced. They had passed selection, completed the Q course, and served in Vietnam. They believed they were the best available. When 4 Australians entered, Mitchell's first reaction was disappointment. They looked ordinary, no imposing presence, no rows of medals, just 4 quiet men in plain uniforms, carrying gear that looked outdated. The leader introduced himself as Warrant Officer Robert Sullivan from the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. He told them they were there for 2 weeks to share reconnaissance and patrol methods developed in Malaya and Borneo. He acknowledged the Americans were experienced and said they would need that experience for what was coming. One American captain, with 3 Vietnam tours, challenged him, saying American doctrine was already the best and asking what could possibly be new. Sullivan replied calmly that they would teach how to move through jungle unseen, how to watch the enemy without being noticed, how to survive for weeks behind lines with only what you carry, and how to function when standard training fails. The American insisted they already did that every day. Sullivan asked why then American reconnaissance teams suffered around 40% casualties, why they were detected and ambushed far more often than Australian patrols, and why American teams averaged only 4 days in the field while Australians averaged 18. The room fell silent. Sullivan announced that for 2 weeks they would train the Australian way, and by the end, the Americans would understand why. SAS teams operated differently. Mitchell asked for the first lesson. Sullivan answered that the first lesson was to forget everything they thought they knew about jungle warfare, because what they knew was getting people killed. What followed humbled American Special Forces, reshaped reconnaissance doctrine, and proved that sometimes allies with longer experience had the better answers. The decision to invite SAS instructors came not from friendship but desperation. By early 1966, American long-range reconnaissance patrols were taking heavy losses. Missions meant to gather intelligence secretly were being discovered, and attacked statistics showed average mission length under 4 days with high casualty rates and frequent unwanted contact. A confidential study comparing American units to SAS patrols in similar terrain showed the Australians staying in the field over 16 days with far fewer encounters despite less technology. The report concluded Australian capabilities greatly exceeded American ones and recommended immediate study. U.S. leadership resisted, believing American training superior. Then in January 1966, an entire American team in Binh Duong province was wiped out shortly after insertion. 6 men sent for a 3-day mission were detected within hours and killed before reaching their objective. The team leader had been Mitchell's friend. The funeral convinced him their training might not match the war they were fighting. Weeks later, he found himself at Fort Bragg, meeting the Australian. Sullivan did not look like a stereotypical elite soldier. He was 34, of average height, lean, and weathered by jungle service. He had joined the Army in 1950, served in Korea, transferred to the SAS in 1957, and spent 9 years fighting insurgents, who knew the terrain intimately. His fellow instructors had similar backgrounds, veterans of counterinsurgency campaigns where patience, stealth, and intelligence mattered more than firepower. His opening talk had no slides, no schedule, and no formal curriculum. He said they were not there to turn Americans into SAS, but to share methods that worked against guerrillas. The Americans used them was their choice. Whether they survived might depend on it. He explained the philosophical difference. Americans were trained to find and fight the enemy. Australians were trained to observe and understand without being noticed. For intelligence missions, invisibility produced better results. Mitchell asked about selection differences. Sullivan explained American selection emphasized fitness and military skills, while SAS selection emphasized mental endurance judgment under stress and independence. He described a test where candidates navigated alone for 60 kilometers through unknown terrain with only map compass and limited food. Failure to arrive on time or choosing an easier route meant failure. Selection lasted 6 months, with most candidates dropping out. Those who passed proved they could think while exhausted, frightened, and alone. Training began before dawn in dense woods. The Americans moved 2 kilometers using standard patrol methods and believed they performed well. Sullivan revealed his team had tracked them easily, hearing noise from 50 meters away, watching them silhouette themselves on ridges, move through a choke point without checking for ambush, and walk within 5 meters of a hidden observation post without noticing. Corporal Henderson stood up from nearby, perfectly camouflaged and undetected, demonstrating true stealth. Sullivan said by Australian standards, the entire patrol would have been destroyed. He explained Americans were trained for tactical movement, assuming contact might occur, while Australians trained for invisible movement, aiming to avoid contact entirely. Speed and firepower were less important than silence and concealment, especially for reconnaissance. Individual movement drills followed. Every American was detected before reaching the objective. Sullivan demonstrated moving 50 meters through vegetation, almost silently, taking 20 minutes, but remaining unseen. He said speed gets reconnaissance teams killed. Patience keeps them alive and produces intelligence. He described a patrol that took 7 days to move only 3 kilometers, because avoiding detection mattered more than distance. Another exercise required remaining motionless for hours. Students failed to find concealed instructors, who later revealed themselves from positions the Americans had looked at directly. Sullivan explained effective camouflage made a soldier resemble natural features rather than a disguised human. Stillness was crucial because the eye detects motion above all else. Students then had to maintain observation posts for 6 hours without moving. Many were detected due to small adjustments or turning their heads, while the Australians remained perfectly still. Through training and discipline, by the 4th day, Americans realized how large the knowledge gap was. Their techniques worked against conventional forces, but not against guerrillas who knew the jungle intimately. Planning exercises showed similar contrasts. Americans proposed helicopter insertion movement along terrain features and reliance on support. Sullivan said this was predictable and would be monitored by the enemy. He described the SAS approach: infiltration on foot, often in civilian clothes, movement through difficult terrain. The enemy avoided concealed observation posts near objectives and planning for no outside help. Americans used advantages. Australians planned to operate without any field exercises, using Australian methods. Were physically exhausting but successful. Instructors repeatedly patrolled the area without detecting the American teams after 12 hours. Sullivan congratulated them, saying earlier they would all have been dead. Mitchell noted the difference was doing it the Australian way. Sullivan corrected him, saying they had adapted, and that adaptation mattered more than doctrine when conditions changed. Subsequent days covered tracking, counter-tracking, improvised medical care, escape and evasion, and silent killing. Tracking focused on subtle environmental clues rather than footprints. Counter-tracking involved deliberate deception. Medical training stressed improvisation and harsh triage decisions. Escape training emphasized avoiding capture entirely. Students experienced capture scenarios, interrogation stress, and forced evasion with minimal supplies. Silent killing was taught only as a last resort on day 10 each. American paired with an Australian instructor for a 2-day field mission. Mitchell worked with Henderson, observing his patient's discipline and constant awareness. Henderson said he learned in Malaya, after years fighting insurgents who knew the jungle better. Respect the enemy, he advised, because assuming superiority could be fatal. Mitchell realized elite performance meant quiet competence and endurance rather than aggression. Integration days focused on adapting Australian methods to American structures, not replacing them. Adjustments included stealthier patrol planning, increased emphasis on observation, revised selection criteria, incorporating mental resilience, and improved fieldcraft. On the final day, Sullivan delivered a blunt assessment. 2 weeks earlier, the Americans were confident, but mistaken. Their training was good for its purpose, but insufficient for deep reconnaissance against guerrillas. He warned they were heading to Vietnam, and that applying these lessons could determine survival. Mitchell thanked him, saying the training had made them not only better but smarter soldiers. Sullivan simply told them to survive, help their comrades, and share the knowledge. Impact spread quickly across units. Procedures changed, training evolved, and selection added psychological components within 6 months. Patrols influenced by SAS methods showed longer mission duration, lower casualties, and reduced detection rates. The improvements were so significant that the Pentagon ordered further exchanges. By 1967, SAS instructors were permanently assigned to Fort Bragg training units. Before deployment, the course influenced changes to the U.S. Army Ranger School and modern selection processes. Culturally, American Special Forces learned that confidence without competence is dangerous, and that allies may possess valuable expertise. Mitchell deployed later in 1966. Using these methods, survived his tour and returned as an instructor, teaching them for years. He later said the Australians saved his life, not by making him tougher, but by changing how he thought, prioritizing intelligence, stealth, and respect for the enemy, including forces like the SAS. Viet Cong. Sullivan retired in 1975 after 25 years of service and never sought recognition, saying they had simply shared what they knew, and the Americans were wise enough to adapt. His legacy lives in modern special operations, where stealth, patience, and cooperation between allies remain essential. The training was never about national pride, but professionals. Helping professionals survive a brutal war. Its lessons remain relevant today as multinational forces train together, exchanging techniques. Each side teaches what it does best, and both become stronger. An anecdote from the first day claimed an American observer mocked the slow pace, asking if that counted as training. Sullivan reportedly replied that it was slow walking that kept people alive, while fast movement often led to death. Whether true or not, the message reflected reality. Australian methods looked unimpressive until one understood that elite reconnaissance meant completing missions without detection, surviving for weeks with no support, and gathering intelligence instead of seeking combat. By the end of the course, American skepticism turned into respect. Mitchell summarized it best, saying he had believed he was elite, but discovered he had simply been well trained. Modern special forces recognize that elite status is proven through capability under the hardest conditions and maintained through continuous learning. The 2 weeks in 1966 reshaped doctrine, saved lives in Vietnam, and continues to influence operations worldwide. 4 instructors arrived quietly and left a lasting transformation, proving that elite status must be earned repeatedly, that allies can reveal blind spots, and that humility can be as important as courage. Countless soldiers survived because Americans listened, learned, and adapted. The true legacy was not embarrassment, but education, improvement, and survival. Training that challenges confidence saves lives, and training that admits you do not know everything is the training that endures.